This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. For those of you who know me personally, you'll know I'm a solutions-orientated guy. I see a problem and I start thinking of solutions to that problem, with the idea being that, well, even if the solution is difficult, at least it gives you something to aim toward. And for geopolitics, that's where most problems live. That everybody knows what needs to happen, but they just don't have the money, the time, or the political will to actually get it done. And so, as expected, I went into this episode looking at the Democratic Republic of the Congo and its war on the east, asking what is the solution here? Is there some sort of roadmap out here that the DRC could follow to actually reach a solution here? And me, naively expecting an answer, asked a member of my team. Okay, so what if these two sides could find peace? What if Kigali and Kinshasa signed a peace deal to end the war? Does that fix the problem? To which they pretty quickly pointed out to me that these two sides have signed peace deals in the past. In fact, have signed peace deals between them 5 times in the past. And yep, here we are. Okay, so what about strength? What if we were to build up the Congolese army and police force? Train the army, reform the police, give Kinshasa the tools it needs to push Rwanda back over the border. To which from there, it was pointed out to me that that's been tried as well. In fact, Kinshasa just recently doubled their military budget, brought up new artillery and aircraft, and even deployed more troops into the region prior to the conflict getting to the point it has. And yet, here we are. Okay, and then so what about sanctions? What if the international community were to come together and put pressure on all these parties? Well, that doesn't solve the problem either, as not only does it cause problems for the wider citizenship of these countries, but as we'll discuss later, the moment you sanction Kinshasa, you simply widen the rift between the east and the west of the country. And when it comes to sanctioning Rwanda, well, for now, let's just say there's some hesitation in the international community to do that. Myself, now desperately looking for some sort of roadmap here, simply asked, okay, what about going all in? What if the UN were able to rally global support and deploy the largest peacekeeping force that they have ever done so to the DRC? Put 20,000 troops on the ground and give them a full mandate to keep the peace in the region. A proposal that would probably be seen as extreme and little more than geopolitical wishmaking. Until you realize they actually have done that. The UN has already deployed the largest peacekeeping force ever wielded by the organization, placing them into the DRC in 1999, watching it fail to solve the issue for 2 decades, and now looking at pulling the force out. Even the most extreme fanciful option hadn't solved the problem. So how is it that this war, right here in the heart of Africa, is still so intractable? Why has this conflict in particular resisted every solution in the usual handbook? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be asking this week, figuring out who's actually in control of the east of the DRC, what solutions are still left on the table, and how exactly we got to this position where even the largest UN peacekeeping force couldn't solve the problem. And so to help us understand how we got here, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. A History of Hard Times.
So across Democratic Republic of Congo, the country hit a terrible milestone in the last years, which was 7 million displaced civilians across the country. So people have been forced from their homes by conflict and conflict-related factors. It's been very, very visible and a lot more accessible than some of the other conflicts in DRC. And it can be quite hard to explain how this context differs over the years.
Hugh Kinsella Cunningham is a photographer based in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo and a multiple grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, who, having only left the DRC a couple of days ago, photographed many of the key battles and events we're going to be talking about here today. In the past, Hugh's work has been awarded the Amnesty International Media Award for photojournalism, the Red Cross Humanitarian Visa Award, and he won first prize for documentary projects at the Sony World Photography Awards. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
1994, the Rwandan genocide tore the region apart. The militias and the soldiers who'd committed those atrocities fled into Congo. When the new Rwandan regime under Paul Kagame took charge, that was an unacceptable threat for them to have East Congo full of these génocidaires. So they intervened militarily using proxy rebel forces and their own rebel forces. And since about 1996, the region has been hit by these brutal wars. And we're talking death tolls in the millions of civilians. And this isn't just to explain to people, it's not millions of civilians killed by weapons. This is conflict in very rural areas. So when civilians are forced from their homes, their home villages, their fields, their life, people, are vulnerable to disease, they're vulnerable to starvation. So people just pass away from stress and all these horrible things that families go through.
Okay, so before we get into everything today, let's take 5 minutes and lay out a bit of the groundwork here. And first things first, for those of you who don't know, we actually do have an entire full episode already on the channel dedicated to the DRC, that being part 4 of our climate change miniseries. So if you want to know more about DRC's history, you can also dig into that one. But for now, these are the basics you really need to know. The Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, is a former Belgian colony located right in the center of Africa. And for starters, it's absolutely enormous. In fact, it's the 11th largest country by landmass, and population-wise, it's also not far off that, being the 14th largest country in the world. Now, geographically, or at least for our purposes here, the country is roughly the same shape as an upright rectangle, except that that rectangle has 2 appendages coming off of it, one stretching from the southeast corner heading towards Zambia, and the other one jetting out directly westward from its southwest corner. And it's this western spur that makes up the DRC's tiny 37-kilometer coastline, with the rest of the country being locked in by 9 separate nations. And who those nations are is also quite important to understand here. So starting at that western appendage and the DRC's tiny coastline with the Atlantic and moving around the DRC clockwise. To the south of the appendage is Angola, and directly north of the appendage is also Angola and the exclave of Cabinda. From there to the northwest is the Republic of Congo, where even though the 2 capitals, Kinshasa for the DRC and Brazzaville for the ROC, sitting just across the river from one another, with these 2 capitals being so disconnected that not only is there no bridge crossings between one another, but when I went on Skyscanner to look up the price of flights from one to the other, it was actually cheaper for me to fly via Ethiopia, doing a 6,000 kilometer round trip, than it was to just directly fly from Kinshasa to Brazzaville. And the oddness doesn't stop there, as when we move to the north of the DRC, we hit the Central African Republic and South Sudan, both of which are major sources of instability and both of which we've covered previously on the show. And from there is where it gets really interesting, as we start working our way down the right side of our rectangle, where from top to bottom we have Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania, those first 3 being the key players in today's story, with the 3 of them running along that top right corner of our rectangle and running along that right edge to about 2/3 down the rectangle. And from there, the last of the neighbours is Zambia, a country that has been massively important to DRC, as quite a lot of their colonial era railway lines end up connecting to the Zambian networks, which from there push it out to ports on the south and east coast. So as you can see, the DRC has pretty complicated relationships with all of its neighbours, but it also has complicated relationships within its own borders as well. As you got to remember, the DRC is absolutely huge. And to put it in perspective, the capital, Kinshasa, which is based right in the west of the country near the Atlantic Ocean, is about 1,800 kilometers away from where most of the conflict is happening here, over in the far northeast corner of the country, which for scale is about the same distance as London to Belgrade. And whilst London to Belgrade might sound perfectly fine for a few Europeans, after all, it's only about a 24 hour journey via car or rail. For the DRC, that journey from Kinshasa to Goma can usually take anywhere between 7 to 20 days. And during some parts of the year, even just completely inaccessible. And the reason for this is pretty obvious: poor infrastructure. Because as things stand, only around 2 to 3% of the DRC's entire road network is actually paved at the moment. And the railway system they currently rely on to try and move their resources out of the country is still pretty much exactly the rail network they inherited when the Belgians left in the 1960s, with very little in the way of upkeep, maintenance, or extensions being done since independence. And much like we talked about with the Mozambique episode, whilst having this railway system is somewhat useful, it's not designed to move populations between the major cities. It's mostly just designed to move large amounts of resources from mine sites to the ports on the African coast, and therefore quite often doesn't go anywhere near major population centres, making transportation even more difficult. And as a result of all of this, you can pretty much imagine why most people who live in Kinshasa in the west of the country may have never even travelled to the east of the country, which causes a problem for anyone trying to rule the country from the west. And right there, that logistical fracture means that the Eastern DRC is often more economically tied to the East African ports than they are to Kinshasa itself. With most of the consumer goods, food, and a whole bunch of other economic lifelines all come into the region from usually ports in Tanzania or Kenya, before then passing through Rwanda or Uganda into the region. So as you can imagine, this puts a pretty large wedge between Kinshasa and the east of the country, with the vast majority of the fighting also happening right out here in the east. Which brings us pretty neatly to our conflict here, where we have two pretty fluid blocs fighting off against each other. Now, on one side of the battlefield, you have the Congolese government forces, known formally as the FARDC, or the Armed Forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, with these guys representing Kinshasa. When it comes to nation states, the only side nominally on Congo's side would somewhat be Burundi, although as we'll get into later, that relationship is a lot more complicated than it seems, and their reasons of fighting are probably not for any sort of love of Kinshasa. But when it comes to non-nation state forces, well, that's where Kinshasa has a few more friends. As supporting the Congolese government forces, you'll also find the FDLR, or the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, an ethnically Hutu military group made up largely of Hutu military personnel who fled out of Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. Now, this group has been active in Eastern Congo for decades now, and their presence in the country makes a pretty big sticking point for Rwandan involvement in the conflict, as Rwanda makes a claim that Kinshasa has been funding this group to one day rearm, reconstitute themselves, and then go back in and reinvade Rwanda. Now, on the other side of the conflict, the guys fighting against Kinshasa here in the east of Congo, from a nation-state perspective, you have the primary actor, which is Rwanda, and somewhat involved in this conflict, Uganda as well. Although again, we're going to get into Uganda's position later on. Much like Kinshasa's side, the more interesting part of the story is in the non-nation state actors, with the Rwandans involving themselves in the conflict both through direct involvement through their armed forces, as well as through Rwandan-aligned forces such as the M23 movement, a predominantly Tutsi rebel group operating out here in the east of Congo. But alongside M23, you also have groups like Red Tabara, these guys being an ethnically Tutsi Burundian group operating out of the east of Congo and targeting both Congolese forces and the government in Burundi. And in addition to those guys, you also have the Congo River Alliance, these guys being a loose network of Congolese rebel movements, many of whom are Tutsi aligned or at least sympathetic to Rwanda's strategic interests out here. The only thing that really binds them together though is their dislike of the government in Kinshasa. Now, I know there's a huge amount of acronyms in there, but to absolutely dumb it down just for now so we can unpack it later, on one side you have the Congolese state and the Hutu Rwanda group, the FDLR, and sometimes Burundi. And on the other side you have Rwanda, sometimes Uganda, M23, Red Tabara, a bunch of Tutsi-aligned rebel groups, and the Congo River Alliance, all of which are now operating, often for different strategic reasons, here in the east of Congo. So, Hugh, you've been watching this conflict for a long time now. So in your opinion, how does this latest round of fighting out here in the east compare to some of the long-running fighting we've seen out here in places like Ituri between the various Lendu and Hema groups?
So the Ituri conflict is militias called Codeco, who attack civilians mostly using small arms and machetes, and civilians of an ethnic group they're targeting are brutally killed. Children are seeing their parents killed in front of them. When they cut people's heads off, they cut from the back of the neck, so the person is alive and suffers more. The M23 conflict is not like that. These are military units equipped with body armor, helmets, great radios, great training, great coordination. This is a conflict between two militaries. So I remember even the earliest days of this conflict. So we're talking about this absolutely beautiful highland area between Rwanda and Congo along the Virunga Mountains. And some of the first attacks came over that border around Mount Mikeno and Mount Sabinyo. So Congolese army troops in these very thinly manned positions started getting attacked by M23, backed up by Rwandan troops. And, I remember going up, sneaking my way up to those border positions in early 2022 and speaking to soldiers who had survived attacks. And they're saying, these guys are coming at us with night vision. They're watching us with drones. This isn't business as usual. And that kind of developed into a few towns in the rural locations falling to M23, Congolese army falling back, and eventually into big offensives that have taken so much territory in North Kivu. And each time there's an attack, each time there's an offensive, you have civilians running for their lives. So people have just a few seconds to pick up anything you can, grab a plastic bottle of water, grab a few pots and pans, grab a mattress, take your kids, maybe a farm animal, and run. because quite a lot of these attacks were starting early dawn. They only have a few seconds. It's absolutely heartbreaking and it's absolutely tragic. And speaking to families there, you have no choice but to be amazed and just horrified by the resilience and horrified by the stories of some things these families have been through over the years. If you speak to a young mother who has kids now and she's maybe in her early 20s, she will remember running down from fleeing their village 10 years ago with her mother when she was just a child during the previous iteration of the M23 conflict. And if you speak to the generation after that, they will remember doing the same things. That context of remote rural attacks, moving into bigger towns being seized, moving into open warfare in the countryside, this gradually escalated until about 2022, and then there was failed efforts to deploy the East African Regional Force, so the Kenyan army, the Burundian army, and the South Sudanese army and the Ugandan army into the region to kind of create a buffer between the Congolese army and the M23. This didn't work.
So on the timeline, this brings us up to about January 2023, where the Congolese government forces launch a large offensive into the areas around North Kivu and Ituri to try and push the opposition forces out of the eastern Congo, this time being aided by a massively increased military budget and support from international peacekeepers. But January 2023 marks an important escalation point in the conflict, as for the first time we started seeing a lot more somewhat higher-end technology entering the battlefield. And most notably, Rwandan-backed forces even managed to shoot down a Congolese Su-25 ground attack aircraft using just man-pads. That's man-portable air defense systems. In other words, shoulder-fired missiles. Now, for outside observers, this was particularly critical, as the conflict was no longer just skirmishes with old RPGs and AKs, and this was now something that looked much more like a modern battlefield. Now, this is the tone throughout 2023, and going into 2024, the war begins to escalate even further, as by now, more and more towns and cities in the east of Congo are coming under attack by their opposition forces. And by this point, because of that massive distance between Kinshasa and where these battles are happening, the Congolese government is starting to already face massive logistical problems in supporting the battlefield, where everything from poor supply lines to the lack of air superiority now pushes them to start arming lots of local self-defense groups, these effectively being unemployed farmers and teenagers. All of this coming at a time when Rwandan forces are also beginning to step up their operations in the region, meaning that whilst Kinshasa is arming their farmers, Rwanda is pushing into the area using more drone strikes and precision raids, as well as semi-motorized infantry columns. And this brings us up to about the 2024 period, where Kinshasa is having major problems supplying the front, and the fighting is very different to previous rounds of conflict, where these local mobilized militias are now up against drones, better technology, and far better trained troops. So Hugh, can you give us a bit of an insight on what this all looked like on the ground?
In 2023, the Congolese army, which had been hiring mercenaries and training up special forces units for the first time, sinking a lot of money into modernizing its decrepit army, bought attack drones and fancy equipment, night vision, all this modern fancy gear. And also the Congolese government mobilized a lot of militias called the Mai Mai. This is various local groups, all with extreme acronyms about, how they're fighting for sovereignty. These groups are remnants of militias that have been operating for years in eastern Congo. They are bandits, murderers, former mutineers from the army in various factions, and they have been terrorizing civilians as much as M23 has. So the Congolese government, lacking manpower, lacking force, they funneled weapons and arms to these groups in the hope that it would slow down the M23 advance. And these groups, militarily, they have no chance against the M23. When you're hanging out with them, it's drunk children, it's kids drugged off their heads, the commanders. It's incredibly heartbreaking to see. So those groups were kind of a measure of last resort. And so from about 2023 onwards, there was this counteroffensive against M23. It didn't work. The M23 pushed back. And then over 2024, they slowly moved to surround the city of Goma, which is a very important city. It's the capital of North Kivu province. It's just on the border with Congo and Rwanda. It has a big port, trade across Lake Kivu. It's a beautiful place. And I remember about December 2023 was the first time you could start hearing artillery on the outskirts of Goma as the M23 were pushing forward. And then early 2024, they seized a front line in these huge hills that overlook Goma. Basically, trapping the city and surrounding it. They also seized a large coltan mine in a place called Rubaya, which is a very high value target. The money is in the tens of thousands of dollars a month, possibly even a week.
So that brings us up to the end of 2024, beginning of 2025, where opposition forces, being primarily led by M23 and Rwanda, continue pushing further into the eastern DRC. First by seizing the key critical supply point of Minova, and then by surrounding the key regional hub of Goma, with Goma not only being an important city to eastern DRC, but also serving as the other key crossroads in the region. And with both these cities occupied, logistics becomes even more difficult for the Congolese. And from there, things get even worse, as a few days later, in a pretty high-profile incident, a Rwandan sniper manages to assassinate the Congolese military governor in North Kivu. With all of this coming off the back of a UN report suggesting that M23 forces were now being reinforced with up to 4,000 regular Rwandan troops. So now with Goma under direct threat, international attention pivots towards the defense of Goma, as again, Goma is not just another regional town, it's a key operational hub for the eastern DRC, as since it sits right along the Rwandan border, it's historically been the linchpin for the control of North Kivu. So recognizing what's at stake, UN peacekeeping forces under MONUSCO, along with the SADC intervention units, are now being deployed into the city to bolster its defenses, awaiting the next big thrust by the opposition forces. And that brings us to about February of 2025, where opposition forces are now massing on the outskirts of Goma, Rwandan supported units are now within striking distance of the city, and a combination of poorly supplied Congolese forces, poorly trained Congolese militias, UN forces and SADC forces are now waiting inside Goma, preparing for a potential urban siege scenario. And with that in mind, Hugh, what now happens from here?
M23 had surrounded Goma, and then there was this huge deployment of South African, Malawian and Tanzanian troops as part of the SADC bloc. Now, the East African bloc beforehand had a mandate to try and calm the conflict, create buffer zones. This SADC force, they were not deployed as a peacekeeping force. They were supposed to defend Goma. And then I remember the South African army and the Tanzanian army, they tried a small push up to kind of break the front line around Goma. It didn't work. So the front line surrounding the city of Goma, it's a tiny geographic area. There's a few key hills you can stand on and see everything. So in 2024, you had bombardments going back across the front line, super close to civilian areas, the worst of which was a salvo of Grad rockets hit a displacement camp of Congolese civilians outside Goma. So this was most likely inaccurate counter-battery fire from M23 and RDF positions up on the hill. One of those rockets hit dead center in a displacement camp. This is this kind of a fragile rows of tents and tarpaulins where families are making a living after they've been forced from their villages. That attack, the official death toll was recorded as 35 killed, but the majority of the victims were children. Because in the middle of the day, a displacement camp, families are kind of split up. Mothers and fathers go to search for firewood, go to search for water, go to try and scrape a living, and children are kind of left to their own devices in the tents. So that attack killed several children. And this is an immensely traumatic experience that civilians here have been going through. So after that, things calmed a little bit. The Congolese army and the SADC bloc were kind of rearming, fortifying the city of Goma, defending the place, waiting to see what would happen next. And then at the beginning of this year, January, all hell broke loose. The M23 pushed down and seized the port of Minova, which finally isolated Goma even from the lake. That was the last route by which food and supplies from the countryside could easily enter Goma. And then the forces clashed at a town called Sake, which is just outside Goma. You had the Congolese army and the militia guys firing back against the M23 and RDF guys coming down. Then you had troop columns actually entering the city of Goma, and urban warfare was going on. It was horrific. There were bodies being found in the street days afterward. There's confusion over the official death toll, but what is clear is that hundreds of civilians lost their lives during this fighting. As a broader thing as well, it was very surprising the complete abdication of any kind of responsibility by the United Nations peacekeeping force. They had previously deployed outside the city of Goma, made a big deal about how Goma and Sake will be defended. A column of Uruguayan troops, who are often some of the most professional and fantastic troops deployed by the UN in other locations. I've been embedded with them and seen them do great work. They were sent out to maintained defensive positions outside of Goma. One of their armored vehicles was blown up, seems most likely from some kind of precision munition fired from the mountains. And then they retreated. Pakistani unit of peacekeepers who were supposed to have deployed artillery, they contributed nothing. There was a kind of a decision from the UN, it seems, we can't fight back here. And that's something that's also been borne out over the past 3 years of the M23 conflict. As the Congolese army retreats, the UN hasn't shown muscle, hasn't fought back against M23 as they did 10 years ago. So that's kind of what the fall of Goma looked like.
So I want to take a moment and go through some of these peacekeeping missions that were involved here. Now, the first of these and the largest one is MONUSCO. That's the United Nations Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Again, lots of fun with acronyms. But at this point in time, MONUSCO is the largest UN peacekeeping deployment anywhere in the world, with the force predominantly being made up of forces from Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Nepal, Uganda, Uruguay, Burundi, Guatemala, Kenya, Malawi, Morocco, Pakistan, Rwanda, although that one gets complicated, South Africa, and Tanzania, as well as having additional contributions from Algeria, Benin, Bhutan, Bolivia, Botswana, Brazil, Burkina Faso, Cambodia, Cameroon, Canada, Czechia, Egypt, France, Gambia, Ghana, Jordan, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Mongolia, Niger, Nigeria, Paraguay, Peru, Poland, Romania, Russia, Senegal, Sierra Leone, Switzerland, Tunisia, the UK and the US, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. And alongside MONUSCO, you also had the SADC forces being deployed to the region. These guys operating under the Southern African Development Community's Force Intervention Brigade framework, which, to simplify things, is effectively a South African-led group that has much more flexible rules of engagement compared to those of the UN forces. And this force being predominantly made up of South Africans and Malawians. Now, initially, both of these forces were positioned around Goma in an attempt to stabilize the situation and deter the opposition from making any further advances into the city. But with the fall of Goma, many of these peacekeeping units began pulling back from the frontline positions. So what I want to understand from you is, how is it that a force this large with this many countries involved was still forced to pull back from the front lines?
In all this chaos, about 14 South African soldiers from SADC were killed. The rest of those units from SADC are just surrounded and disarmed in their bases, eventually being held hostage by M23 and Rwanda. These are absolutely just insane stories going on, and there's no clear resolution for any of it. The UN, of course, in terms of their research and their information on the ground, quite a lot of their information came from reconnaissance drones they were flying. That's not an option anymore. Firstly, those were grounded due to jamming, and now they're not flying anymore. So actual visibility on troop movements and stuff in the countryside is pretty lacking right now. So basically, wait and see what happens.
So Goma falls to the opposition forces, and almost immediately after the fall, we see the situation start to unravel even further, with Rwandan-backed forces quickly launching additional offensives, seizing key towns like Sake and Karuba, while at the same time, Ugandan-aligned militias push northward, capturing strategic points like Bunagana and Bunia near the Ugandan border. And by the end of February, the situation here in the east had escalated to the point where the United Kingdom finally began formally imposing sanctions on senior Rwandan government officials, now even going as far as to formally accuse Kigali of backing militant groups inside Congolese territory. By this point, though, the writing was on the wall, with most of the UN and SADC forces beginning to pull back from around the contested area, and Rwandan-backed groups moving in to occupy the key administration points and mine sites. So Hugh, with all this going on, what do you think Kigali's long-term strategic goals actually are?
I mean, that's important to remember what is actually happening to civilians as M23 occupies these areas. They have come in, they have kicked in the front door, hundreds of civilians killed in the crossfire, and now an occupation is starting. So it's very obvious that the plan is not to negotiate and leave Goma. The plan is that these guys will administrate Goma, sort of a soft annexation. They're installing mayors, they're installing governors, vice governors, trying to establish themselves there. But what is also happening is targeted killings, who are critical of M23 have just disappeared or are being held. Every night there is gunfire and shooting in Goma. It's not a safe place right now. And I was recently in Rwanda to photograph the commemoration events for the genocide against the Tutsi memorial events, which take place on the 7th of April. So I had a chance to witness Paul Kagame's recent speech. And for a memorial event, it was shockingly focused on foreign policy and how people telling him and Rwandans what to do, that they should go to hell. that anyone sanctioning them is not a partner to be trusted, and it is better for Rwandans to die with dignity, die fighting, than be told what to do. There is also so much to be said about how civilians have actually been surviving in these areas for years. But look at the scale of this violence. There's about 5,000 to 7,000 Congolese refugees who fled to Namakira camp, and long-term, the Kiziba camp has about 14,000 refugees who fled in 1996 and who are still in Rwanda. The scale of the violence, and then you look at the size of the displacement camps that were created as people were fleeing the front lines from M23, it doesn't correlate at all. Over 1 million people in camps outside of Goma at risk of heavy artillery. There's a lot of M23 propaganda and narrative that they're there to protect civilians against these militias, but that kind of ignores the fact that most of those militias were only refunded, remobilized, and re-energized as a direct result of this intervention into East Congo.
Now, the official line coming out of both Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, and Kampala, the capital of Uganda, has always been pretty consistent in why they're getting involved here, with both governments claiming that these military interventions into the Eastern Congo are preemptive security measures, necessary steps to neutralize hostile forces basing themselves across the border in DRC. You see, they argue that these eastern parts have effectively become somewhat ungoverned spaces, harboring anti-government militia groups capable of launching cross-border raids into Rwandan and Ugandan territory. And with Kinshasa demonstrating very little ability to actually project authority out here, both Kigali and Kampala have asserted that they've been left with no choice but to occupy some of these frontier regions, essentially trying to create a buffer zone to protect their own national security. Again, that's the claim they're making. But what's your assessment on this? How logical do you think that call is?
Well, the concept of the buffer zone is interesting because this thing about the FDLR features very heavily in the Rwanda narrative.
Michael here, jumping in with a quick editor's note, as I know there's a lot of acronyms that have been thrown around. So just as a reminder, the FDLR are the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, this being an ethnically Hutu militia group seeking to overthrow the majority Tutsi government in power in Kigali. Okay, now back to Hugh.
Previously, the Rwandan army had been authorized by the previous president of Congo, Kabila, to deploy on limited operations to hunt the FDLR. Now, with the fall of Goma, most of North Kivu, and a lot of South Kivu as well, M23 and the RDF hold all these areas where the FDLR were active. What else is there to do? You have taken this ground. And again, when I've been on the ground over the last 2 months and seen the M23 troop columns heading off here, heading off there, seeing how this new administration is forming, there's so much more than a security operation on your border. If you wanted to root out a militia group on your border, what does that have to do with you installing your own border officials and your own mayors?
So if that's the logic behind this intervention, how far do you think they'll actually go? Do you think we're likely to see M23 or Rwandan forces pull back over the border once they feel they've created enough security around the area? Do you think they'll just stick with what they've captured at the moment to just consolidate their gains around that? Or now that they've achieved this level of success on the battlefield, and Kinshasa has been proven to be not as much of an obstacle as many people thought they would be, may end up having either M23 or Kigali decide to reevaluate some of their objectives here, maybe deciding that now's the moment to push further, either pushing south towards a major city like Kananga, or pushing north toward the key crossroads at Kisangani, or even in the worst case scenario, like we saw in previous Congo wars, marching all the way westward to capture Kinshasa itself and force a regime change in the country. So from your perspective, how far do you see this offensive actually going?
It seems quite likely that there aren't enough troops available for them to go too much further right now. What is clear, though, when you see the troops and you're actually spending a limited amount of time with the M23 soldiers, is how different, how much better their training is than the DRC militia groups or even some of the DRC army units are uniformly equipped with body armor, professional radios. They move with discipline, and the public events are also fascinating to witness. When Bukavu fell, I was able to attend an event where the Congolese police units who hold the city officially surrendered to M23. And it was a very well orchestrated event. The M23, General Bernard Biamungu, who was previously responsible for some troops that committed massacres in Kishishi, he was there, giving a very well thought out speech about how you've spent your lives being guided by hatred and xenophobia. We are building a new Congo and you'll join us. And then these police officers were sent for ideological training. Perhaps they'll join M23. It's fascinating to watch. But again, what is important to remember in these big geopolitical moves is you've got millions of civilians stuck in this, suffering through the same poor living conditions as they did before, but with more stress. So the displacement camps around Goma, when M23 took the city, they said, okay, well, we've won the conflict now. There's no more humanitarian crisis. These civilians can go home. So there was a mass displacement, but in the other direction. Civilian communities packed up their stuff and walked home. And it wasn't something a lot of civilians wanted to do. They were worried if they would even have houses left. And then we went back to people's homes, and we found like RPG warheads, body armor, defensive positions everywhere in people's villages. Just about 2 weeks ago, I was at another village called Kibumba, which was a point of very heavy fighting. People's houses were destroyed. Civilians who have returned to their homes have no drinking water. I met a mother who was collecting stagnant water by using a tarpaulin outside her house to catch rain overnight. Civilians are the principal victims of all this, and that's something that is so key to remember when we're talking about big geopolitical and international pressure.
So that brings us to about March 2025, where the situation on the ground begins to shift, at least diplomatically, as on March 18th, Rwandan President Paul Kagame and the Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi met each other in Doha for direct talks over the conflict. Now, to outsiders, this was a very significant development, as it marked the first face-to-face meeting between the two leaders since M23 began its offensive earlier in the year. Now, from Kinshasa's perspective, the motivation to engage in these talks is pretty clear, with the Congolese army under pressure and more cities falling to M23. But for Rwanda, the calculation is probably a little more complex, as even if Kagame agrees to a ceasefire with Kinshasa, the reality is that M23, or at least officially, operates autonomously from Rwanda, which raises a pretty critical question, as even if Kigali and Kinshasa do reach an agreement, does that agreement effectively cover the actions of M23? After all, this is a group whose original purpose for springing up was a reaction to previous negotiations that they didn't agree on the outcome to. So considering these dynamics, how realistic do you think these peace talks actually are? That if the two governments actually do agree to a settlement, does it actually end the conflict?
In the sort of the halls of power, everyone knows which troops are deployed where, and press releases have finally started coming out saying Rwanda must withdraw its troops from Congo. And all of this is like an extremely complicated, convoluted way of kind of disguising what's truly happening. What's interesting this time is that most of this military success of the M23 wouldn't have been possible without Rwanda. So it's kind of looking at the history books and looking at how conflict has changed now with technology. Drones, electronic jamming, surface-to-air missiles, these kind of like force multipliers that were used to push the Congolese army back, this very modern kind of vicious warfare, conjoined with the old school brutal usage of militias and child soldier recruits. But it seems very unlikely that M23 would have had the success they currently are having without that kind of technological backing, without the manpower backing. So it wouldn't be clear if this time they would actually be able to move away from that support and stand on their own without Rwanda.
So in that case, what do you see for the future of the conflict? What should we be on the lookout for over the next few months?
A lot depends on how stable Kinshasa stays, if there's a concerted effort to negotiate or perhaps fight back to reclaim some of this territory. That could be something to watch. But I think at the moment it's clear that Rwanda and their intervention has been an extremely well thought out and successful operation. They were working in this kind of disinformation space for years, to almost like Russia and Crimea, little green men. How can you prove that a soldier works for a certain army if he doesn't have a flag on his shoulder? If you deny and create fake information, you can get away with a lot. And there was a fantastic piece in The Economist which likened Kagame to the president of Russia, talking about Kivu as a Crimea, using these themes of, there are populations who speak a certain language in here that must be protected, even if you're kind of dallying with half-truths. And also, I think a good comparison to make is the war in Nagorno-Karabakh. You had the Azerbaijan army was able to kind of like resolve, as they wished it to, this kind of long-running conflict once they had kind of like invested in new military equipment, a new force of arms, and they were able to overrun the defenses and claim back this land that they desired. 2023, when there was heavy fighting, the Congolese army was able to use its air force to make a substantial dent in M23 forces. They were able to use their Sukhoi attack jets. You could see them going in over the hills with these extremely loud engines. You could see the helicopters firing rockets. But at a certain point, the Rwandan army deployed surface-to-air missiles and really high-quality jamming equipment, which put paid to a lot of that
So all of that brings us to about this phase of the conflict, a moment that feels pretty eerily reminiscent of past upheavals in the region, as today we find ourselves at a point where, whilst fighting has died down slightly, the trajectory of where this goes next is still very uncertain, with no one really sure whether Kigali will seek to consolidate its recent gains, whether the DRC will be able to acquire international partners and reclaim some of this lost territory, or why previously staunch allies like Burundi and Uganda have now adopted a much more reserved stance towards Rwanda. So why is this conflict so different from the previous ones? And right now, what is each side looking to get out of it? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. Power Politics.
Eastern Congo has a history of conflict. It's an area of weak state control from Kinshasa. It's so far away from the capital. And it's also an area of the Congo that is very influenced by neighboring politics. And so the politics of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi in particular have an influence over the contours of what occurs in that region. The reality is the Democratic Republic of Congo is being pulled by its neighbors.
Alex Vines is the director of the Africa program at Chatham House and an expert on the internal politics of the African continent. Prior to this role, Alex also chaired the UN panel of experts on Côte d'Ivoire and was a member of the UN panel of experts on Liberia. He was also a member of the Commonwealth Observer Group to Mozambique and Ghana and worked at Human Rights Watch as a senior researcher on African arms, business and human rights programs. So, we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
The infrastructure of the Democratic Republic of Congo has been vastly ignored by previous governments. It's the cost, it's the scale, and that administrations in Kinshasa don't want easy transportation around the country because it's already such a large state to administer. And so one of the ways to protect against coups and insurrections is to make transportation movement difficult, the DRC territory. So all of those things go together. And then the emphasis has been about extraction, and the main ones do go through Eastern Congo or down through the Zambian copper belt down to Southern Africa in particular. The coastline of the Democratic Republic of Congo is tiny, and that's just the mouth of the Congo River. So if you're living in Goma, you really feel more East African. I mean, there's even the language issue that Swahili is used in parts of Eastern Congo.
So what are Kigali's justifications for getting involved here in the east of Congo?
The Rwandan official narrative is that this is all about protection against genocidaires who were involved in the genocide in Rwanda, and that therefore Rwanda is a bit like Israel that needs to create a cordon sanitaire around it and protect itself. And so security is a prominent driver. I don't think that's fully correct. I do think security is one issue, but I think trade, investment, and the richness of the mineral resources of the Democratic Republic of Congo is part of the reason for Rwanda's engagement in the Eastern Congo.
So whilst Rwanda is the big state actor here, M23 are the group driving a lot of this story. So can you take us through who M23 are and how they fit into this story?
So M23 is an armed group that says that it wants to change government in Kinshasa. It's also known as the Congolese Revolutionary Army. It has been active before in the North Kivu area, which borders Uganda and Rwanda, and it claims that it's a member of something called the Congo River Alliance, a coalition of rebel groups in eastern DRC, although the reality is that it stands out very much from other groups. It was formed in 2012 and saw action during the first rebellion against the Congolese government that happened in 2012 when it took control briefly of Goma, the capital of North Kivu, and a swathe of territory. However, in 2012, the Congolese army with UN peacekeeping troops retook Goma, and with international pressure, including the threat of sanctions by the UN and Western countries, the M23 announced a ceasefire and re-entered peace talks, and then it kind of disappeared. It really then reappeared again fleetingly in 2017 but a reorganized and very virulent M23 then reappeared in 2022 and has grown from strength to strength. And for folk like myself that have observed the Democratic Republic of Congo for many years, has surprised us by capturing locations like Goma, for example, and Bukavu. I did not think that we would have a repeat and, in fact, have a much worsened situation than the one we saw in over a decade ago.
So the claim out there is that M23 are backed both with military weapons, training and logistical support by Rwanda and the government in Kigali, with the group even occasionally being accused of being a foreign policy arm of the government in Rwanda. But in your opinion, how much truth is there to that statement?
Well, the independent UN panel of experts reports at least 4,000 Rwandan troops embedded in with M23. I think the number's probably quite a bit higher now than that. And by all accounts, it seems that the Rwandans themselves did the training, provided the weapons and ammunition, and have done a lot of the fighting. So they do seem to be an auxiliary of Rwanda, from what I can see from what the Rwandans and from what the UN is saying and various other parties. And so I think that explains the M23 success. I mean, one expert jokingly told me that Rwanda does the fighting and M23 take the selfies after territory has been captured.
Now, this is all really interesting, as on paper, none of this should be happening the way it is. I mean, if you're just looking at the raw numbers I have here in front of me, you'd assume the conflict would be going pretty much the other way. After all, the Democratic Republic of the Congo has one of the largest armies in sub-Saharan Africa, boasting around 128,000 active personnel and a military budget sitting somewhere north of about 1.1 billion USD. Whereas, by contrast, Rwanda only has about 33,000 personnel and a defense budget that's roughly about a sixth the size of DRC's at about 174 million. And if the UN reports are to be believed, well, they only actually have a few thousand personnel operating on the territory of the DRC. So, in other words, you have about 4,000 personnel from the Rwandan armed forces, alongside somewhere around 8,000 M23 personnel, up against most of the Congolese army. And this disparity becomes even more confusing when you start looking at deployment maps, as a massive chunk of the Congolese army is actually already stationed permanently out here in the east of the country, with the west of the country, where the capital is, mostly being reserved for rapid response and Republican Guard units. In other words, brigades deemed probably more loyal to the president, making the numbers out here in the east even more lopsided for the Congolese. And yet, despite all that, the battlefield picture has been looking incredibly one-sided throughout this campaign. And over the last few months, M23 and the Rwandan aligned forces have continued to make more and more gains, capturing key towns, encircling critical routes at the RN2, and forcing numerous Congolese units into a series of chaotic and uncoordinated retreats. In fact, we've even seen entire FARDC brigades that were once already forward deployed into these areas, simply being rolled back or melting away at the slightest pressure. So what is actually going on here? Can you take us through why we're seeing this crazy disparity?
So I think one of the problems has been that the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo are demoralized, can be well equipped, but they're not well trained. With the fall of Goma, the Congolese had hired a bunch of mercenaries from Romania who spectacularly underperformed and had to then kind of lay down their arms and leave with their tail between their legs, going through Rwanda to be repatriated to Romania. So the Congolese armed forces really don't seem to be up to the job to contain a military disciplined force like the Rwandans. And I have a feeling that's the key reason for the fall of Bukavu and Goma. We'll have to see where M23 say they're marching on towards Kisangani, which is a major city in the DRC, and then opens up better road, for example, to Kinshasa.
Now, obviously, most of the attention here has been on Rwanda and their backing of M23. However, it should also be noted that this isn't just a two-country war, and there are at least two other very major players with boots on the ground here, both of whom are now watching these events unfold with growing concern, and in some cases are actively shaping the battlefield themselves. So to start with, let's take a look at Burundi, which sits on the eastern border of the DRC and just south of Rwanda. Now, this is a country with a very small GDP, and a military of only around 30,000 active personnel, but it's one that's been quietly shifting its alliances in recent years, as in 2018 they signed a security cooperation deal with the Russians, and then in 2023 they formalized a new bilateral security agreement with Kinshasa, signaling a big change in policy for the Burundians, who in the last Congolese war had been on the opposite side of Kinshasa. Now, as a part of that deal they signed with the DRC, Burundi deployed just over 1,000 troops into the DRC, mostly focusing on carrying out counter-insurgency operations in the south of Kivu, where most of the fighting's happening today. As officially, they were there to help Kinshasa root out a group called the Red Tabara Movement, a Burundian rebel group that's long used Congolese territory as a staging ground for raids back across the border back into Burundi. Again, I hope you're following along. But in mid-February, everything changed. Burundian units in the south of Kivu began clashing with M23 forces as they started advancing out from Rwanda, and within weeks, most of the Burundian forces had decided to pull back after reportedly suffering some pretty significant losses. And then by March of this year, things escalated again, after the Burundian president openly accused Rwanda of preparing to launch a future invasion of Burundi itself. That once they'd won their battles in the east of the DRC, they were planning on turning south and capturing Burundi. Now, that is a huge accusation from the Burundian government. But given the momentum that the Rwandan-backed forces had inside the DRC, and the rapidly deteriorating relationship between Kigali and Gitega, how likely do you think it is that Rwanda could actually follow through with some sort of invasion of Burundi? Or is this just a convenient way for the president to pull back his troops that he was finding it increasingly difficult to supply?
I think that's a kind of political posturing at the moment. I'm not sure there'll be an invasion of Rwanda into Burundi. The stakes are high. The EU has slapped some sanctions on Rwandan officials as well as M23. The region is under tight scrutiny, so I'm not convinced. I mean, they are pushing boundaries, but officially the Rwandans are denying that they're in eastern Congo, that it's M23. But what it does signal is the dangers that Congo could go back into a broader conflict if things really deteriorated.
Now, unlike Burundi, which has a much smaller, less agile force structure, Uganda actually fields one of the most capable militaries in the region. In fact, on paper, these guys really should be the heavyweights of this conflict, as their defense budget is the largest of any of the four states, and their GDP outstrips both Rwanda and Burundi combined. But yet, rather than jumping into this conflict head-on, they've been quite reserved in their actions here, and instead Uganda has been mostly focusing its operations on a completely different front, operating in the far northeast of the country, mostly in the Ituri province, with their operations usually targeted toward the Allied Democratic Forces. Now, despite the name, the ADF aren't some ragtag band of guerrillas fighting for civil rights. In fact, they're a Salafist jihadist group with long-standing ties to ISIS. Now, being one of these ISIS affiliates, as expected, the group is fairly poorly funded and armed with pretty basic equipment, but it still remains one of the most lethal armed groups operating anywhere in the east of Congo. In fact, the group is blamed for around 3,000 deaths over the past 3 years alone, which explains why Uganda has been targeting the group even though they operate in the east of Congo. Now, this operation involved pushing around 1,000 troops into the northeastern DRC, bringing its total footprint in the country up to around 5,000 people, depending on who you want to talk to. And by late February, the Ugandan People's Defense Force had entered the city of Beni, the capital of the Ituri province, with the Congolese army units that had held the city reportedly pulling back before they ever had to fight the Ugandans. And Kampala didn't stop there either, as Ugandan forces from there pushed even further into the DRC, securing towns like Luna and reinforcing bases in places like Komanda and Mahagi, even in some cases pushing as far into the DRC to directly engage Congolese forces. So what I want to get from you here is, what is Uganda's overall plan here, and where does it draw the line between going in and fighting an insurgency like the ADF, or going as far as to actually push back against soldiers of the DRC?
The Ugandans are looking at this very closely. Their relationship with Rwanda is not particularly amicable, and they also are looking at how their posture in Congo could benefit themselves. So the Ugandans have in the past been involved in the Congo. They were there in the first Congo War, but they've also tried to play a role in terms of the East African community in finding a solution to the crisis in Congo. So Kampala is at a crossroads deciding how is it going to handle the crisis in Congo and what is the national interest of Uganda.
Now, we'll circle back to Uganda's domestic politics in a bit, but before we do, I want to take a second and refocus back toward Rwanda, and in particular, why both Kigali and Kampala seem to be flying a bit under the radar here when it comes to international security and pressure. Because when you ask people within the African peacekeeping community, Rwanda has a fairly mixed reputation. Because for all these headlines and their involvement in DRC, they also happen to field some of the most professional and reliable peacekeeping forces. We're talking about a force here that's deployed thousands of troops under UN banners to the Central African Republic, about 2,600 into South Sudan, a handful into North Sudan, and nearly 4,000 troops into Mozambique to fight the insurgency in the north in Cabo Delgado, where crucially it was the Rwandans that actually succeeded in the peacekeeping operations where Wagner's troops had failed. So these peacekeepers are often viewed as not only efficient, but also responsive and pretty reliable. So when it comes to calling out Kigali and their more controversial activities here in DRC, do you feel there might be a bit of a dilemma here for some of these states, where they may feel that if they go too hard on Rwanda, they risk Rwanda either pulling their peacekeepers out of their own countries, or even pulling their troops out of a neighbouring country where the resulting instability would flow back to their country? Something I'm sure is going to be pretty front of mind when Western nations need to be less and less enthusiastic to put their own troops on the ground here in Africa. So do you think Rwanda's peacekeeping roles in other countries are pushing some of these nations to not criticise their actions here in the DRC?
At an international level, Rwanda has been seen as an important contributor to peacekeeping. So you mentioned the Central African Republic, and I've just finished a conversation with some diplomats discussing Rwanda and its military contribution to Mozambique and just how important it is. And in terms of what I've seen in Central African Republic and northern Mozambique and spoken to Rwandan forces there, but also local populations, the Rwandans are pretty professional outside their near abroad. The problem lies when you put them in their immediate neighborhood and they have other incentives, targets, and ambitions.
Now, I can somewhat understand the political calculus behind a country like Mozambique. After all, Rwanda's peacekeepers are doing the heavy lifting there, and they are keeping a lot of the infrastructure in the north of the country more safe. But what about the bigger players here? What about the ones outside of the continent? As for the most part, their response has been pretty muted. I mean, sure, the UK has imposed a handful of very targeted sanctions on some Rwandan officials. But Washington, for instance, has been far more cautious in their approach toward Kigali, where even while Tshisekedi goes on Fox News and talks about how close his administration is going to be to Washington, the State Department has done very little outside of just voicing concern over Rwanda's involvement in the Eastern Congo. And there's been no real diplomatic pressure, no economic penalties, and no arms cut off for the Rwandans. So the question becomes, why? Do you think that Washington is willing to tolerate these kinds of cross-border incursions for the sake of what it perceives to be a force that brings wider regional stability?
I think a trend that we're already seeing that isn't just in Africa is that the Americans are subcontracting quite a bit of mediation to Middle East Gulf actors. And so I think that's probably how this will play out. American boots on the ground, I think, is very unlikely. I can't see that Trump administration want to get involved in that way. And I can't see the US sending rockets down on Rwandan military installations.
So another part of the calculation here might just be the justifications these guys are using for their operations here in the eastern DRC, as whilst you have Uganda justifying their presence as anti-ADF operations, fighting a group that's not only tied to terrorism and associated with Islamic State, it becomes somewhat easier for other nations to then somewhat justify their presence here in the country. And if we look at Rwanda's case, well, they claim to be operating here in the east to counter FDLR troops, who they claim are the same troops who wish to carry out a similar genocide to the one in 1994. Now, whether that's true or not, it at least gives some political cover for them to operate the way they have been. Where I would really argue, though, is how far those justifications can be pushed. As, for the sake of the argument, if these countries then deepen their footprint here in the DRC and those lines begin to blur even further, at what point do you think the international community begins to push back on these operations? If Rwandan forces, let's say, move beyond the Kivus, or start launching long-range strikes into the Congolese interior, do you think that will be enough to trigger an international response and start to see more pushback on the Rwandans?
My fear remains that annexation of territory remains rather a la mode at the moment, but the point remains that for Africans, this really is a red line of redefining international borders.
So with M23 now having taken not only towns like Goma and pushed further east into the country, securing key towns like Walikale, that puts them within about 400 kilometers of one of the country's major crossroads and logistics points, the city of Kisangani, a town that is so crucial to Kinshasa's defense that if it does fall, it would become nearly impossible to supply any of the forces out here. If that town were to fall or be taken, do you think that's the line in the sand that the international community would probably look to get involved?
So if Kisangani falls, it would be a tripwire that could escalate the context into something like a second Congo war. It would also see deep doubts in Kinshasa about the longevity and utility of Felix Tshisekedi as president of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And maybe they would start thinking about other options. So all sorts of things could play out in this. Tshisekedi himself, I think, originally was countenancing a new constitution and maybe having a third term. I think that's much weakened now. So that's a clear result already with the events that we've just seen in Eastern Congo. And I think this is also one of the drivers for Tshisekedi now, thinking that if he can reach a strategic and critical minerals deal with the Trump administration and get American backing, that might shore things up. So I think that's one of the incentives of the Congolese government to be as robustly wooing the Trump administration on the mineral issue as they are currently.
And how likely do you think it is that either Rwanda or M23 has the capabilities to push further in and take a city like Kisangani?
My sense still is that M23 is very reliant on supply chains, training, and assistance in fighting from Rwanda. This is all denied by Rwanda, but that's what the UN and other sources are indicating. So I suppose that does raise the question then, does over time the M23 obtain more confidence, more skills, and discover that it can actually operate without that umbilical cord of Rwanda? I have my doubts at the moment, but the longer this drags on, the more likely that scenario could occur. You saw this in the Cold War, proxy forces that the US invested in, be they the Mujahideen or UNITA in Angola, that over time developed their own agendas and agencies and then followed their own ambitions and directives and became much less clients of US Cold War ambition. I have to say, I think Kisangani would be the big shot. And if then M23 got onto All River Road and started moving towards Kinshasa, they're in the business of regime change.
So we find ourselves in a deeply complicated conflict, one where Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi all have strategic incentives to remain involved here in the DRC. And while these outside powers cause problems for Kinshasa in the east, Kinshasa also has to turn to outside powers to try and solve the issue in the first place, looking to nations like China, Canada, and the US to try and secure some sort of assistance to bring the conflict to an end, and unfortunately finding itself increasingly isolated when it tries to do so, with diplomatic momentum also increasingly slowing down. So the question now becomes quite critical. What can Kinshasa actually do to resolve the issue? Should they be trying to solve this themselves? Or should they start to form an African coalition like they did last time? Or should they be looking to outside powers to try and bring the assistance they need? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. The New Normal.
Part of the reason why we continue now to be on the brink of a third Congo war is simply because the underlying tensions and the other underlying causes for conflict have never truly been resolved. After each round of fighting, we have a new government, we pretend everything is okay, and we haven't actually improved governance inside the Democratic Republic of Congo itself.
Michael Rubin is the Director of Policy Analysis for the American Enterprise Institute and an expert on the security and politics of the Middle East and Africa. Before his position with AEI, Michael was a former Pentagon official, a political advisor to the government in Iraq, and an analyst with the Foreign Military Studies Office. And having just recently come back from Central Africa, we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
So, as you know, I've had experience both in Kinshasa, but I also hiked in from Uganda illegally across the border into the DRC, into the M23 territory last year to spend some time with M23. And the difference between the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo side versus the M23 side was really noticeable in terms of civil affairs. Simply put, M23 paid much more attention to civil affairs, whereas the Congolese coalitions, pro-government and so forth, were impressing locals to do unpaid farm labor. They were taxing farmers before harvest when the farmers didn't have money and so forth. The M23 was being much more careful. They weren't forcing people to work, to drop their day jobs in order to harvest And at the same time, they were delaying taxes until the farmers could actually pay them, and they weren't making the taxes onerous. And the other thing that M23 seems to be doing is they're learning a lot from their mistakes. You had a situation where some of the impressed child soldiers or adult soldiers from the Congolese side were basically saying, enough, if we're going to be forced to do this, we might as well join the other side. They'll treat us better. And at the same time, whereas before they were afraid that perhaps their loved ones in Goma or under DRC control would be retaliated against, what some of them were saying is, look, they're treating us so poorly anyway, the DRC government that is, that we have nothing to lose. This is one of the reasons why Goma fell so quickly. And Goma also didn't rise up. You had a surplus of food on the M23 side because the farming, the agricultural was better. The DRC government hadn't been letting the food through the checkpoints.
Now, if you look at the reasoning behind why so many of these people are starting to look away from Kinshasa, there are a few camps of thought as to why this is all happening, with some people pointing to the differing treatment of these ethnic groups in the east, whilst others argue that, like in most occupations, a decent portion of the general public ends up just going along with where the wind's blowing, often just out of sheer pragmatism. Whilst if you look at a third camp, well, they'd probably argue it's more of an economic issue, that this part of the country has been underfunded, underdeveloped, and overlooked for many, many years now. So people here have been trading, working, and even intermarrying with the communities across Rwanda, Kenya, Burundi, and Uganda for many, many years now. And frankly, they've probably become more economically integrated with these groups to the east of the DRC rather than the groups in Kinshasa itself. So when you hear people ask you, why do these eastern communities tend to lean eastward? What would be your answer to that question? Why do you think that a lot of the groups here in the East tend to sort of orient themselves that way?
I think to some degree that's true. The people in Goma, they lean towards Rwanda and Uganda economically, simply by proximity. And remember, Goma isn't 100 kilometers away from the border. It abuts the border. It reminds me, for example, of Detroit, where in Detroit, Michigan, I look across the river and there, right on the other side, is a continuation. It's just in Canada. And you have other countries like this, where you have contiguous urban areas that are divided by international boundaries. So when it comes to talk about the Rwandans doing this, look, people in the east of the DRC are naturally going to want to work with the Rwandans and vice versa. What the Rwandans want, and this was the case up until around 2 or 3 years ago, they had excellent security relations with the DRC government. The intelligence cooperated against the local militias. You actually had some degree of security within Goma. On a dime, when Tshisekedi decided he was going to run for election and he had no other platform, that's when the ethnic incitement started. That's when you severed the aerial links, Rwanda air flying to Kinshasa and vice versa to Kigali. The fact of the matter is, you're just seeing a natural geographical trade develop. But when it comes to good governance, look, Rwanda isn't a democracy. For that matter, however, Kinshasa is not a democracy. The fact is, between the two, Kinshasa is more a dictatorship that's corrupt, somewhat akin to what we would see once upon a time in Yemen or we see in Somalia. But while you see a lot of embezzlement in the Kinshasa government, anyone who goes to Rwanda will note the lack of dysfunctional corruption. And so people are starting to embrace the Rwandan sort of system.
So one of the other angles here that I find particularly interesting is just how well known the players in the story are. As this isn't just any collection of political unknowns, most of the presidents here have been in power for a while. As an example, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, he's been in power since 2000. And Yoweri Museveni, well, he's been president of Uganda since 1986. And these guys have weathered coups, insurgencies, and diplomatic fallout before. Now, when we compare that to Tshisekedi, well, he's only relatively new to the role, having only been president for a few years. And so is much more likely to be focused on trying to secure his position in power than either of the other two. Now, the most interesting out of these three, though, personally, I think is Museveni. As with Museveni now pushing past 80 years old and reportedly having some health issues, from what we understand, he is starting to think about transition in the country. And there's a push to position his son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, as his successor. However, for any of that plan to really work, Museveni would need the military to be firmly on side during the transition period. And here's where the problem lies. You see, Uganda's military on the issue of the DRC isn't unified at all. In fact, from what we understand, roughly about half of the officer corps is somewhat sympathetic or even cooperative towards M23 and M23's goals in the DRC, when the other half are either neutral or just flat out opposed to the group, which means Museveni finds himself in a classic military conundrum, where if he decides that he wants to get more involved and deploys his anti-M23 units into the fight, well, he risks heavy casualties and that half of the army consuming all the materials. And in doing so, ends up tipping the balance of power inside his own army in favour of the M23 aligned soldiers. On top of that, he's also probably aware that if he were to try to do the opposite way and order his pro-M23 side into battle, well, that just ups the risk of open mutiny or even rebellion in the country, at a time when he needs nothing but stability. So he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. So the question for you, Michael, is how does this war shape the transfer of power in Uganda? And more importantly, does Museveni still have enough command and control to be able to pull it off without setting fire inside his own ranks?
The fact of the matter is, a lot of these people who are leaders today have transnational experience. So I think Kabila had worked previously in Tanzania. You had Kagame, who had previously worked in Uganda, and so forth. The thing to understand is that the Burundians, the Tanzanians, the Congolese, the Ugandans all know each other. One of the big things to look at in the future is, as you mentioned, the transition in Uganda. Most people believe that Museveni is going to be replaced by his son. The problem is his son couldn't even be the valedictorian of the summer school class. He's not the most talented fellow, and he may not be up to the task. Gossip among Ugandans, among Rwandan, among Congolese and Tanzanians is basically about how incompetent Museveni's son is and will be, and whether any of the other family members will sort of intervene. So one thing to look at in the future is Uganda's stability. And of course, when any country has a vacuum in the region, and whenever any country has a new government, you're going to have the neighbors try to influence them. You have the same dynamics in play in the Horn of Africa with Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea trying to influence in the past Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And you have similar dynamics at play with Djibouti and Somalia. So you have that dynamic in Uganda.
Okay, so what about Burundi? Because their situation's quite different. Their president, Evariste Ndayishimiye, he actually came to power through an election, winning at the ballot box in 2020. However, there is speculation around that election, with his opponent dying just 1 month later, and Ndayishimiye often being seen as the military's man in leadership. How is this conflict going to affect his presidency?
When it comes to Burundi, Burundi is the poorest country in Africa per capita. And the Burundian leader is not the most talented fellow. In Rwanda, in Congo, you find a lot of Burundian journalists, a lot of Burundian dissidents, and a lot of Burundians who simply are coming because they can't get food anymore inside Burundi because of the collapse of agriculture and so forth because of mismanagement. The president of Burundi got up against the backdrop of this and said, well, I grow avocados in my garden. I don't think there's any country in Africa that is more ripe for revolution today than Burundi itself. And one of the reasons why the Burundian president has wanted to send Burundian troops on peacekeeping missions and so forth into the eastern DRC, although they've now been pulled out and so forth, is because he doesn't want the troops in his own country because he's afraid of his own troops. It's also a mechanism to get some of his troops paid. And so you are going to have a vacuum inside Burundi itself.
Okay, so let's bring it back to the DRC and talk a bit about the military here, since we're on the subject anyway. Now, we ran through the numbers a bit earlier on in the episode, but on paper, this really shouldn't be a close fight. The DRC's military budget is nearly 5 times that of Rwanda. They've got a much larger population pool to draw from, and they have access to a much wider spectrum of platforms than either Rwanda or Burundi, with the DRC not only having just the standard things like an Mi-24 or an Mi-8, but also having access to, I won't say modern, but fairly decent planes like the Su-25. Now, I understand the catch that most of this decent kit is currently being hoarded by elite units like the Republican Guard, whose primary mission is probably not national defense, and instead more focused towards protecting the president and Kinshasa itself, and that by doing so it does leave the troops at the front line somewhat undertrained and under-equipped. However, that still doesn't fully unpack how the DRC has been so consistently losing in these lopsided engagements against Rwanda or M23. So I want to ask you, where is this money going? That despite all this investment in the Congolese army, they're still failing to hold territory against a force with 1/5 the military budget.
One of the biggest complaints that the Tshisekedi regime and others in Kinshasa had was the United Nations had insisted on a reporting requirement for Congolese military purchasing. The Congolese government saw that as infringement on its sovereignty, and in order to make the Congolese government happy, during the late Trump administration and early Biden administration, the United States actually worked to remove that reporting requirement at the UN Security Council. And so that basically opened the door for the Congolese government to basically just throw money at all these high-end military platforms. Now, here's the danger. When you're sitting in Kinshasa or any other capital like that, you can confuse high-end military equipment with actually having a well-trained army. And of course, he was also importing mercenaries, mainly from Eastern Europe, but those mercenaries didn't have the same will to fight as perhaps some Congolese who would be truly loyal to Tshisekedi in Kinshasa would. And so when the balloon went up, many of them simply threw down their weapons rather than fight to the death.
Now, the two PMC groups I assume you're referring to here are Al Jamira and Rafrole. Now, the first of those, Al Jamira, is a private military company technically headquartered in Bulgaria, though it's owned by a Frenchman named Olivier Bazin, someone with a rather colourful past. Having been convicted back in 2009 for smuggling gold out of Gabon, and previously involved in moving arms into the Ivory Coast during its civil war back in 2011. So it's fairly safe to say he might know his way around sanctions. Now, the original pitch for Al Jamira here in the DRC was actually straightforward. It was to get the Congolese Air Force back into the sky and keep them running. Hence why most of the crews that Al Jamira deployed in here were ex-Bulgarian, Belarusian, or Georgian pilots brought back into service to maintain and train on Soviet and Russian-era aircraft, as well as bring in new platforms like small consumer-grade drones. This being the reason why a lot of locals would call these operators Mr. Drones. But whilst they were reportedly quite effective at facilitating deals between rebel commanders, regional administrators, and Chinese mining interests, they also did noticeably worse when it came to combat. And these days they do very little fighting, and instead spend most of their time just making phone calls. Now, that second PMC group to try their luck here was Rafrole, these guys being far more like a paramilitary unit than the previous. From previously published reports, the group was led by a former French Foreign Legion officer, a Romanian man named Caratu Potra. However, in contrast to Algerim, these guys were actually brought in to do combat operations, or at least hold defensive positions in key areas in the east. Now, these soldiers being used in Rafrole do usually have experience operating here in the continent, with most of these units having worked mine security in either Sierra Leone or the Central African Republic. However, mine security is very different to fighting a war. And when these units were thrown into engagements with M23 and the Rwandan regulars, well, they found themselves getting pretty badly mauled. All of which was then made more complicated when their leader, Potra, found himself being increasingly distracted with the Romanian elections happening back home. The CEO allegedly having close ties with the right-wing candidate, Jalin Georgescu, with the CEO's house in Romania also coming under police raid, where they found 24 kilos of gold, rocket launchers, and grenades in his private residence, all of which was happening at almost the exact same time that Goma was coming under attack. So we can probably understand why his focus might have been elsewhere. So yes, PMCs have been tried here, but much like Wagner in Mozambique, they pretty much failed to deliver. But to bring the conversation back a bit, I want to circle back to the major player here, which is the United States. You see, under the Trump administration, Washington has shown far more interest than usual in the DRC, particularly when it comes to the nation's strategic minerals, things like cobalt, coltan, and rare earths that are critical to everything from green tech to advanced technology. Now, back in April of this year, the US had facilitated a peace agreement between Rwanda and the DRC, which we're going to unpack in a bit. And then in May, following that deal, exploratory talks began between the United States and the DRC around major mineral deals between the two. Tshisekedi even going on Fox News to try and sell the deal, likely hoping to trade mineral support for political stability. However, that deal is supposed to come out in a few weeks from now, and no one's quite sure how far Washington is really willing to go with it. So the question remains, if US mining companies are given this kind of free rein in the Congo, do you think we'll actually see a deeper US commitment to the government in Kinshasa?
The United States is starting to pay a little bit of attention, although there's a lot of inconsistency in Washington's part. And the Trump administration is supposedly getting more interested in the mineral deal with the DRC. At the same time, we're talking about dissolving the Africa Bureau within the State Department and shuttering a lot of the American embassies. That said, diplomacy would still continue apace because Trump would replace the Africa Bureau with a special envoy who would just have direct missions across various African countries. Now, that said, very quietly, you had Tshisekedi's family members. His brother, who acts sort of as a de facto national security advisor to Felix Tshisekedi, come through Washington trying to strike these deals. The problem is that Tshisekedi is increasingly desperate as the noose closes in, as he loses control over sections of his country. And so, at least across the partisan community of Africans in the United States, in Washington right now, one thing that both Democrats and Republicans agree on is that making a deal with Tshisekedi would be making a deal on paper that probably wouldn't come to fruition.
Now, I can kind of understand that level of skepticism, as mining here in the DRC has a pretty checkered past. You see, as things stand right now, the two big exports out of the DRC are copper and cobalt, with the main destinations for these minerals usually being China, the UAE, or India. And China, for what it's worth, currently holds equity in all 15 of the country's largest copper mines, with China extracting these minerals cheaply here for refinement and use in production back in China. However, in recent months, we have started to see cracks in China's dominance here, and there are other players starting to edge in. For instance, the DRC is now the number 2 destination for Canadian FDI, with Canadian mining interests showing more and more interest in the area. However, these numbers are still way below what China does, and most mining companies tend to treat the DRC with a lot of skepticism. As of the last decade, we've seen some serious issues in quite a number of mines, where in some cases mining operations have been forcibly taken by local militias, or in other cases company staff have come under attack, and as a result the insurance premium for operating in this region has become astronomical. And this all becomes a pretty vicious cycle, as these miners, because they're not willing to put in large amounts of capital and bring in mass production facilities, they instead often operate these mines using artisanal methods, which is effectively just a huge number of people using shovels and pickaxes rather than 21st century equipment. All because they don't want to risk bringing in heavy machinery that could be seized or sabotaged by locals, which in turn lowers the efficiency and therefore profitability of each of these mines. But before everyone thinks this is an ad for a mining company, let's be clear here that the miners aren't innocent either. Not only are there frequent abuses towards the locals, with absolute horror stories coming out of these areas, but these miners also pay regular bribes and consistently fail to build the infrastructure in the local area that they promised to do so when they got the contract. And the attitude you seem to most consistently find operating out here from miners is, well, if we expect to be here for 2 years, we should build a road that lasts 2 years in 1 day. Now, Kinshasa has been making all these noises about pivoting away from China and inviting more Western involvement into the country. And there definitely is some appetite for that, at least on paper. Is it actually realistic to think this is going to go ahead, considering China still owns most of the pits, the roads, and the ports?
When it came to the revocation of some of the Chinese licenses and so forth, we've seen this in other countries before. The former president, under whom many of these concessions to the Chinese were granted, Joseph Kabila walked home with his pockets lined. And when Tshisekedi came in, he resented the fact that a lot of the bribes had already been dispensed by the Chinese to the previous regime. And so I think what we saw was less principled governance and more a personal shakedown, which ultimately the Chinese renegotiated and paid up to some extent.
So if we swing back to the conflict for a moment, whether it's over mining rights or not, one of the major objectives of both the Rwandans and the Ugandan administrations seems to be the creation of a buffer zone in this area, with Kigali in particular sending local administrators to run these areas by proxy and keep a militarized buffer zone between what they view as people coming to get them and the rest of their population. Now, on paper, for Rwanda at least, this makes some sort of strategic sense. It's a much smaller country, and people have seen what these militias have done in the country before. But the question I have is this a viable solution, particularly in this area of the world? Because as we know with these kinds of buffer zones, things are pretty unlikely to stay still for very long. And what starts as just a 5 or 10 kilometer strip of territory is almost certainly going to blow out to 10, 20, 30 or 50 kilometers, sooner rather than later. And for now, let's not even get into the can of worms that happens when some of these mines caught up in the buffer zone may either incentivize Rwanda and Uganda to expand their territory, or may incentivize the mining companies to fund these expansions in exchange for cheaper licenses or special considerations. Again, there's just a bunch of bad incentives built into the model. Because once you've allowed these external powers to establish de facto controls over chunks of your territory, it becomes increasingly harder to actually be able to reinforce where those lines should be drawn. So with that in mind, do you think that Kinshasa should be pushing to retake this territory as quickly as possible, even if it does cause massive problems for their country? Or should they accept these de facto buffer zones and work to wind down the hostilities that take place within this region?
You can talk about a buffer zone, but you can't talk about this whole region without thinking about the 1994 anti-Tutsi genocide. When Paul Kagame was able to drive out the Hutu genocidaires, they settled in just across the border in eastern DRC, but they went into the refugee camps that the United Nations was maintaining, and the United Nations never disarmed them. Now here, the fact is that Rwanda, along with South Sudan, is one of the most expensive peacekeeping missions, and it's clear it's not keeping peace. And so I have seen UN bureaucrats, UN leaders of the peacekeeping team come through Washington desperate because they believe that the Trump administration might simply slash the budget of what the United States gives to peacekeeping. So whether they want to or not, the UN Secretary General seems inclined to have some serious reform when it comes to MONUSCO, the UN peacekeeping mission there. Now, my job as a think tanker isn't simply to highlight the problems, but it's try to come up with out-of-the-box solutions. And when I'm in Eastern DRC, given the fact that we seem to be in Groundhog Day, we seem to be seeing the same actions again and again, one of the policy proposals which I would put forward is we should look at North and South Kivu the same way we look at Iraqi Kurdistan. That is, have some degree of local federalism, because you have absolutely no trust given the genocides, given the ethnic incitement which has occurred repeatedly. So when you're talking about having a buffer, why not have some degree of local autonomy? I would actually say that would work better in North and South Kivu, because in Iraqi Kurdistan, one ethnicity dominates, the Kurds. But in Eastern DRC, you don't have any group, even the Congolese Tutsis, who have a majority. They don't even have a high plurality. And therefore, you're going to have coalitions of various ethnic groups working together. Now, again, all politics is local. And when I talk to people in the M23 area, you've got a situation where people will say that the Congolese constitution simply hasn't worked. Because under the terms of the federalism that exists after the Second Congolese War, you were supposed to have the local communities remit their taxation, their revenues, their customs to Kinshasa, and Kinshasa would give 40% back to the local provinces. The problem is they've been remitting the revenue, but they haven't been getting anything back. So a lot of people in the region are primed for some degree of local governance, where they would actually be able to keep their own customs revenue and taxation and use it for their own good.
And that brings me right to the big question of the episode, and probably the most controversial one of this entire conversation, as we have to realize that this region has been in conflict for decades now. And while I do acknowledge that Kinshasa and Kigali are having talks in Doha or sitting down for a US-brokered Declaration of Principles, a document that some media outlets have categorized as a peace deal, in reality on the ground, almost nothing has changed. Rwandan troops are still operating within Congolese territory, and Ugandan forces are still dug in across multiple zones. And when it comes to M23, well, they don't exactly take their orders from Kigali, not officially anyway. So even if Rwanda did agree to pull back, to me that doesn't at all guarantee that M23 won't strike again, particularly if they think they have the upper hand or see DRC pulling back from the area. In fact, as I record this, there are fresh reports just hours old of M23 fighters committing war crimes here in the east, to which I hope at some point helps people understand my skepticism here. So I guess for me, the question becomes, are there any actual solutions left on the table here? Or are we more likely to just see the international community look the other way, throwing Kinshasa to the wolves, in hopes that Rwanda will continue their peacekeeping missions in their backyard?
Well, let me put it this way. The Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping at the United Nations, Lacroix, is a former French Ministry of Defense official who was serving in the Ministry of Defense during the anti-Tutsi genocide in Rwanda in 1994. He tends to come across as very anti-Rwandan, but even he said that whatever the frustration is with Rwanda, he doesn't see any movement to force the Rwandans to withdraw from their peacekeeping missions in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, and so forth. But it's not only the UN peacekeeping in which the Rwandans are involved. They have a lot of bilateral deployments. So, for example, they alone, were responsible for defeating the Islamic State in northern Mozambique in the Cabo Delgado province. Now, the Southern African Development Council had sent forces, Angolans, Tanzanians, South Africans, and so forth, but they didn't really do anything. And across the continent, there's increasing frustration that the South Africans are all talk, little action when it comes to counterinsurgency. You have an interesting dynamic also in Africa where Rwanda will pair bilateral deployments with their UN peacekeeping contributions. So in the Central African Republic, you have the Rwandans in charge of the peacekeeping for the United Nations, but then you also have a separate Rwandan force. And the advantage there is the bilateral forces can do stuff. For example, interrogate prisoners or even conduct very rapid fire missions that you could never get done in a timely fashion given the nature of the UN bureaucracy. And oftentimes pairing these two are very valuable, where you have the United Nations passing intelligence to the Rwandan bilats. And then the Rwandans will take action because the UN recognizes that something needs to be done and that no one else has the capacity to do it. In the Central African Republic, because of this dynamic, you also had a situation that when it looked like insurgents were going to march on the capital, Bangui, you had Pakistani and Egyptian peacekeepers camped right outside the Rwandan forces' base because they knew that the Rwandan forces would fight back and protect them in a way that they themselves weren't able to do or wouldn't have the permission of the United Nations to do, especially with the Islamists taking over many countries in the Sahel and a concern in Western Africa about Islamist insurgents across certain regions. You have the Beninese government, you have the Togo government, all talking to the Rwandans about possible deployments there. The question is who's going to fund those deployments. In the past, the Rwandans have done it themselves in exchange for business opportunities. Now, the question is, with the new Trump administration, would give some of the money that would previously go to peacekeeping and simply give it directly to the Rwandans to act as peacekeepers who, in a way, are able to act much more forcefully than the United Nations itself can. It's a new model that's developing in Africa. As many African nationalists say, African solutions for African problems.
So, how do we fix it? Honestly, I don't have an answer for you this week. The DRC is just a whole complication of its own, and a country where the usual roadmaps simply don't work. You see, even if you try and give more money to Kinshasa, that money tends to just stay in Kinshasa. You can try and bring more private enterprise into the country, and most firms just invest either the bare minimum, often throwing accusations of having their assets seized, their contracts repeatedly rewritten, and their operations now having to deal with an increasingly fluid frontline. And for any peacekeeping force trying to operate out in this region, even just getting a standard convoy of bullets and bandages to the frontline can sometimes take weeks to make happen. This isn't Mali or South Sudan. Here, the distances are bigger, the jungles are harder to traverse, and the enemies often don't wear uniforms. And for Kinshasa, as much as it looks one way on paper, it looks a very different way on the ground, as in this particular conflict, they're actually up against actors that have a far larger strategic toolkit, where large parts of the African continent are far more invested in the stability of the other side. After all, everyone's trying to keep Uganda stable at the moment, trying to avoid what is likely to be a messy political transition from becoming an even messier civil war. And when it comes to Rwanda, it gets even more difficult, as over the last 30 years, Kigali's gone from this pariah state to a development darling, positioning themselves as the go-to partner for everything from peacekeeping in Mozambique to logistics for Sudan and even digital infrastructure for half the continent. So whether it's countries being directly helped by peacekeeping, like Mozambique or the Central African Republic, or countries neighbouring these peacekeeping operations like Tanzania or Ethiopia, everyone has an incentive to look the other way and simply write the DRC off again. And this reality also poses our next awkward question, which is now that Rwanda has established itself in these areas, and the DRC seems incapable of pushing them out, at what point do the miners, the diplomats, the investors, and even some of the people on the ground just start accepting this as the status quo? At what point do they all start quietly shifting their recognition from this state that nominally controls it to the one that collects the fees on the ground? I am certainly not the first person to take a look at the DRC, and I very much won't be the last. And whilst some say we probably tried too hard, others will say we probably haven't tried hard enough. But the reality is that as long as M23 and the FDLR are still there on the ground, even when we do have these uplifting peace deals between Kinshasa and Kigali, those agreements are hardly worth the paper they're written on. Because at the end of the day, Kinshasa is the only side actually incentivized to stop playing this game out here, whilst everybody else has kind of already figured out how to win it. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. It feels absolutely great to be back, and I look forward to unpacking everything very soon. But in the meantime, if you want to see more content from us or get more info, well, you can do so by following all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I want to thank TB, Travis, Alex Turner, Lindsay Nichols, Leo, and Kathy and Brent Irvine. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys. So if you feel you have a couple of dollars you could spare each month, and you want special access to full video presentations and maps, exploring topics like this weekend's live stream, examining each of Russia's overseas bases and installations from 1946 to now, or one of our other videos, giving a full presentation with maps and timelines outlining the fall of Assad and where his forces went wrong, well, you can do so by joining our Patreon today, the links to which are in the description, and we'd greatly appreciate it. But for now, this episode on the DRC and the war in the East is all thanks to these guys. As usual, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first being Cobalt Red, How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives, by a friend of the show, Siddharth Kara, for a close look at the mining trade within the DRC. The second being Africa's World War, Congo, the Rwandan genocide, and the making of a continental catastrophe, by Gerard Prunier, for a more in-depth look at the First and Second Congo Wars. And the third being Warlord Politics and African States, by William Reno, a slightly older book today, but one with fantastic insights into the tactics that have been used by rulers in these areas. I want to thank this week's guests, Hugh Cunningham, Alex Vines, and Michael Rubin for coming on the show, and I also want to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers of this piece, them being Jamie Tanu, Jemima Pentreath, John Davenport, and Robbie Sutton. As always, this area is pretty tough to research, so they did an amazing job pulling it all together. In addition to those guys, I'd also like to thank Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Givella, Nate Ostella, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donlan May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz Van Kierbilk, Ben Spencer, Andrew Gundle, John Luke Davenport, Scott Missler Ferguson, and Sean Cottle-Lem, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanu, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Volgarten from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. As always, this is the best team in the business. For now though, the Red Line will be back much sooner than last time. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.